Okay, so hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming along to this, which is the third in our series of online lectures for the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies. My name is Martha, I'm the project coordinator for the centre, and tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr Finnian Gerety of Brown University on the subject of Om. Before I tell you a little bit more about Finn, I just want to because I think we probably have some people who are new to the centre, just explain a little bit more about us and what we do. SOAS is one of the few places to have an MA in traditions of yoga and meditation. We also have the Hatha Yoga project there. So there's lots of going on in the area of scholarship around yoga. So our job as the centre is to kind of help disseminate that research, but also sharing the research of others as well. So we've been running live events and also a summer school for some time. Obviously, I've had to change all of that in the light of what's happened recently. So today, very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Gerety. He is a historian of Indian religions, focusing particularly on sound and mantra, and especially Om, for which he has a book coming out soon, which very much looking forward to. His research combines work on pre-modern texts, but also ethnographic research, fieldwork in contemporary India, so today. He gained his PhD in South Asian Studies from Harvard University, was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University, Institute of Sacred Music, and is currently visiting assistant professor of religious studies at Brown, where he teaches courses on mantra, yoga, ritual, and the senses. So I will now hand over to Finn and let him tell you a bit more about what he's going to be saying.
Okay, thanks so much, Martha. And it's great to see all of you signing on. Greetings from Somerville, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, where thank goodness it's a sunny day today. And I really want to express my appreciation to this SOAS Center of Yoga Studies, the amazing work they do, the great people, instructors and students and scholars that are affiliated with that, and to Martha Henson and Ruth Westerby in particular for the logistics and this invitation, and for Jim Allenson, the director, and his leadership. I don't know about you, I hope everyone's healthy. I am, and I've never valued my scholarly practice as much as I do right now in these kind of times of madness and suffering and ennui. So I'm really grateful to be thoroughly absorbed in something, a project like this, like my current book project on Om, and looking forward to talking to you a little bit about writing Om. So without further ado, let me share my PowerPoint. And I'll begin my remarks on writing the sacred syllable, the history of Om in script and image. Now, as all of you know, the sacred syllable Om is a sound, right? That is to say, it's a Sanskrit mantra that millions of people chant and meditate on every day. But Om is also a visual or a graphic sign, most prominently written like this. And the history of Om as a sound stretches back some 3,000 years to the earliest Indian texts and ritual traditions. But its written forms are much more recent. And as I work on my book project on the history of Om, I found that everyone always asks me the same question. They want to know, where does this written sign or glyph, as I'm going to refer to it today, come from? And I'd even be tempted to say that the glyph has become better known worldwide in some respects than the sound it represents, right? Through tattoos, t-shirts, and other kinds of visual culture. And so the written symbol has become an icon in its own right, representing Hinduism, Indian religions, yoga, meditation, and Eastern spirituality. So this evening, I'd like to begin my remarks with a deceptively simple question. And that is, why is Om in modern Devanagari script written like this, right? As you can see on the screen, with a loop or a little kind of stroke on the right-hand side. This is distinctive. No other word in Sanskrit follows precisely this graphic pattern of representing a similar sound. And some scholars and practitioners have explained this famous Om glyph by noting that the sound Om can be separated into constituent phonemes, right? Constituent sounds. And many of you may be familiar with this sonic analysis of Om because it follows Sanskrit rules of Sandhi or euphonic combination, that the sound O, if you kind of break it into parts, is made up of an and an U, and then finishes with a ma in the case of Om on your lips, or a nasal, right? Om, right? You can kind of slow it down and say it out loud yourself. You're all muted, so feel free to try. Right? Those together combine to form this sound. So the thinking goes that the glyph for Om may have followed a similar pattern, right? And that you would see, for example, this Devanagari sign for A on the left, then a Devanagari sign for U, then a Ma, or a kind of Chandra Bindu, right? The dot and moon that represents a nasalized sound, all somehow combined into this composite glyph that we know so well, right? Thus forming a distinctive symbol. Now, I'm quite skeptical of this explanation for reasons that should become clear as I take you through the historical record. But to begin, let me just cover some facts about writing Om in Devanagari and other modern Indian scripts. On a very basic level, explaining the graphic form of Om should be simple, right? We would expect Om to follow the norms of Sanskrit orthography, right? The conventions of writing the language. And so this slide illustrates the orthography of Om in modern Devanagari script. And according to these conventions, we would expect the sound Om to be written with an initial O character. So for any students of Sanskrit or readers of Sanskrit, that may be familiar to you on the left, that O character that represents an initial O sound. Then combined with a short or ma, right? So in the second example, that's represented by an O character combined with the ma, and then a virama line, that line that takes off the short that's part of all, automatically part of all signs in the Sanskrit syllabary, and changes it to ma. So you just get Om, right? That's how you would write it if you were just using the basic principles of orthography in your Sanskrit 101 class. You write the O, you write the ma. We also have other possibilities, right? Because sometimes that ma sound, when you use Om in certain mantras and contexts, is not a full ma, but rather a kind of shortened nasal labial, like the anusvara representing here with the dot. So you'd get an O sound plus a dot, right? Om, a slightly more nasal sound. Or a different way of representing the exact same sound is with the Chandra Bindu, right? And so that's the O character with the Chandra Bindu. And so this is how we would expect to see it written widely, right? And yet, as I've mentioned already, this most prominent Devanagari glyph for Om combines that familiar initial O sound with the Chandra Bindu, but in this distinctive and unusual way. Now, Devanagari is not the only Indian script used to write Sanskrit. And so the Devanagari Om is just one among many glyphs for the syllable in India's modern regional scripts. And here you have a slide with 9 contemporary examples. In the top row, starting on the left, we have an Om and Sharada script from Kashmir. We have a Jain Om, which we might associate with the kind of home of Jainism, Gujarat and Rajasthan. We have Om in Malayalam script from Kerala. Then the middle row, we have Om in a Bangla script from Bengal, that familiar Devanagari Om associated with northern India. The Kannada or Telugu Om from Karnataka and Telangana. And now in the lower row, we have a Tibetan Buddhist Om and a Sikh Ek Onkar symbol. And then finally, the Tamil Om, right, on the lower right. And if you know anything about these other languages, you'll recognize that all of these glyphs, you know, in spite of their differences, follow the same orthographic principles that I just outlined. A character for an initial O sound, joined with a character for a nasalized or shortened M sound, right? O and M, right? Om. And so leaving aside some quirks and peculiarities and some stylizations and kind of graphic design elements, we can see here that we write Om in modern Indian scripts following the same basic principles we used to write any other sound or word in Sanskrit. And yet the status of Om as a sacred syllable definitely sets it apart, right? Chances are you wouldn't show up to a lecture for writing, you know, any other random Sanskrit syllable necessarily, right? Something about Om is special. The Om glyph is stylized in ways that normal words are not. And even people who do not read Sanskrit may still recognize it. So in this respect, Om is not like other writing in Sanskrit, right? And this is the aspect of it that makes it a visual symbol or an icon. And the syllable's iconic status becomes obvious if we look at some 20th century Hindu posters of gods in Om, which my colleague Richard Davis has shared with me. Let me show these to you. Here we see Shiva in Om, and I just love this poster. I could just look at it for hours, so many great details. But among those is the way the kind of god Shiva in his kind of ascetic guise, it's sitting cross-legged in a lotus, and that's framed by an Om sign made up of snakes, right? And I just draw your attention to this Chandra Bindu, which is formed by this cute little green serpent here. We also have Krishna or Madhava with his partner Radha together in a kind of sharing an amorous moment in the night sky in an Om where the Chandrabindu kind of doubles as an actual moon in this visual landscape. And then we have Rama and Sita seated in Om. So images like this from the 20th century remind us that the visual history of Om is not just a matter of writing, it's also a matter of iconography. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the visual history unfolds between and in the interplay between these two domains, writing and art. Of course, other domains like religion and ritual are also crucial, right? And yoga, and I'll come back to those aspects later. To study written Oms, though, we need epigraphy and paleography, the study of inscriptions, manuscripts, and the development of scripts over time. To study iconographic Oms, we depend on art history. Now, surprisingly, these disciplines have produced very little work on Om's visual history. And so my talk today and my current research aims to fill this gap. I'm going to survey some previous scholarship on the topic from the last 100 or so years, and then offer my own visual history of the sacred syllable. And by way of background, it's going to be helpful to know some facts about the ritual use of Om as a mantra, as a Sanskrit syllable or formula used in chanting and meditation. Om is first attested in the Vedas, where it is considered the essence of sacred speech. Vedic texts were composed orally by Brahmin priests in the early first millennium, before the Common Era, well before the advent of writing in South Asia. And so the point I'd like to emphasize here is that Om begins its career as a strictly sonic phenomenon, chanted in Vedic sacrifices. Nevertheless, conventions of chanting Vedic Om will come to influence the syllable's later graphic development. So let's think about some of these chanting conventions. In the first place, Om often introduces other mantras, as in this Vedic utterance, Om Bhur Bhuva Svar, Om earth, atmosphere, heaven. And some of you may recognize this as a prelude to the Gayatri mantra. That's where many people encounter it in mantra practice in the modern day. And so this general practice of using the syllable to begin not just this mantra, but various mantras in the Vedic tradition informs a somewhat later, but still ancient custom of using Om to introduce and conclude Vedic recitation as a whole, right? If I'm going to sit down and chant a Vedic text, I need to begin it with Om. So according to the law codes of Manu, a classical text on Dharma from the early centuries of the Common Era, quote, at the beginning and at the end of Vedic recitation, the student should always recite the syllable Om. If it is not recited at the beginning, the Veda slips away. If it is not recited at the end, the Veda wastes away. And that's from Patrick Olivell's translation, right? So this kind of codifies this already long-standing practice of using Om to auspiciously signal the beginning of recitation, right? In the same era, Om also is attested as the opening of familiar devotional formulas, Om Namaha, plus the name of a deity, right? So this is the Namaha or Namas that you hear in Namaste, right? Homage or praise to you. And so examples of this would be Om Namah Shivaya, right? Om homage to Shiva, or Om Namo Narayanaya, Om homage to Narayana or Vishnu. So with this in mind, for the next couple of minutes, let's see how previous scholars have traced Om's early history as a written sign. The oldest clear examples of writing in India are the inscribed edicts of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, dating from around the 3rd century before the Common Era. And most of these are Prakrit inscriptions in the oldest Indian script called Brahmi. In 1877, the Orientalist Alexander Cunningham noted the unusual juxtaposition of two characters, a swastika and the Brahmi sign for Ma, on the rock edict at Jaugada in Orissa. And you can see that here on this slide. You'll note, somewhat larger than the rest of the text, this kind of curved swastika-like form, and then this other form separated from it, which is a circle with a little half moon on it that represents, or is thought to represent, a Ma sound, and looks a lot like the Ma in Brahmi. So Cunningham suggested that the combination of swastika plus Ma, together framing the inscribed text, might represent Om. And I've blown these up on the side of the slide here so you can see better what I'm talking about. Pursuing the same idea a few decades later, H.K. Deb observed that the swastika is composed of nothing but two Brahmi O's crossing each other. So here's some images from Deb's article. And let me pause here to explain. The sign that's labeled with a number 1 is the Brahmi sign for O, for an initial O, right? So if we were to find the representation of a word beginning with O in the Brahmi corpus, it would begin with this sign, this vertical line with two little kind of capitals and going opposite directions, right? So basically, Cunningham and then Deb's idea, ingenious and a bit creative, was that if you combined that sign with number 2, which is an inversion of it, and kind of superimpose them on top of each other, you would get two Brahmi O's together for this long O sound, right? Such as these kind of swastika-like forms represented in 3, 4, and then slightly curved in the particular edict we're talking about in 5 and 6. And then, so the thinking goes, you would combine that with the Brahmi sign for Ma, and you'd have Om, right? This extra long Om. To explain the necessity of using two O's, right? Because usually you don't see Om written that way. Deb referred to the specialized Vedic technique of lengthening Om in recitation. And this is originally called the pranava, where you at the end of a mantra, add Om and lengthen it. Oh. So there's this kind of resonant, performative emphasis. But this argument really fails to convince me. For one thing, the edict we're looking at is the only instance of this symbol in the entire Ashokan corpus. So the question remains, why doesn't it appear at other sites? And next, it's doubtful to me that Om, the essence of the oral Vedic corpus, right? This is a corpus that was meant to be chanted. It's doubtful that Om would be used to begin this written text about the affairs of state. And then it seems even less likely that Ashoka would have used Om in a lengthened form that's primarily used in Vedic sacrifice, right? So at the time, it's a highly technical, esoteric form of Om. And then finally, there are no parallels for writing Om in the way that you would have to write it to read the Jaugada Edict in that respect, with an O here and a Ma way far over there, right? That just doesn't show up. And in fact, later scholars of the Ashokan corpus have argued that given the placement and larger size of those characters, the swastika and the Ma are pretty likely to have been graffiti that were added to this inscription much later, right? So this kind of interpretation of those signs as Om has been pretty well discredited. So what do we learn from this? Well, if Brahmi inscriptions, which are the earliest known Indian writing, do not attest the sacred syllable, then what are the oldest inscribed Oms? Answering this definitively is going to require a lot of digging, right? And I'd welcome you to send me along anything you find. I'd be grateful. We basically have to look through tens of thousands of classical inscriptions, right, to find the kind of the oldest one. But in the meantime, lucky for us, there's a bit of a shortcut. We can use paleography, right, the study of scripts and how they develop over time, in order to kind of predict or hypothesize what the earliest Oms might look like in Brahmi-derived scripts. And I'd remind you here that all Indian scripts currently in use are based on Brahmi. So the slide I'm sharing right now shows the development paleographically of the character for an initial O sound. On the left, we see that familiar Brahmi O from Ashoka's time, a vertical line with corners on the top and bottom. And then as we move across in time, it changes. So by the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, the kind of next 2 or 3 signs, the corners of that Brahmi O start to soften and form something like a backwards S. And then by the 6th to 7th century, the O sound starts to look a lot like our modern numeral 3, right? And incidentally, starts to resemble something like the way we write Om in modern Indian scripts. And so using paleography to kind of hypothesize this and predict this, we can guess that the oldest Oms, when we find them, should look something like these later O shapes, right? Along with the diacritic mark of some kind to indicate the nasal or the short Ma. And miracles of linguistic science, we get some confirmation of this in a Sanskrit text of Buddhist Tantra from the 7th century cache of manuscripts found in Gilgit. And to date, this is the oldest Om glyph that I have been able to find in Indian material culture, in manuscript or inscription. And this, interestingly, appears in a mantra, right, introducing the famous Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. And looking at the slide, you can see it at the top of this folio, the manuscript towards the right, where it introduces the manuscript. And then I've blown it up again below that to the right, and then included a much larger facsimile in my own hand of this Om, right? So around 600 of the Common Era, that's the oldest material culture example of Om that I've been able to find. It has that characteristic 3 shape that we were predicting that is an initial O in this period, plus a diacritic dot to represent nasalization, and then some kind of line below, right? We can't really tell exactly what's going on, but that's the basic way we describe the form. And again, I would be happy if someone found an earlier example, right? This is research that's ongoing. So in your reading, in your own exploring, if you do find examples, please share them with me. If we move on to the 9th and 10th centuries in Nepal, Dominic Goodall has alerted me to this Om from a manuscript of the oldest surviving Shaiva Tantra, the Nishvasa Tattva Samhita. And as you can see here, this is 2 different instances from Goodall's apparatus on this text, and actually 3 representations of Om, repetitions of Om in under A here, right? And you can see here that it has that familiar O character, but instead of a dot, right, like a Chandrabindu, it has a mini ma. This is a ma in the orthography of this Sanskrit text. And then a line, a virama line under it to make that ma into So we have Om. So a different form than we saw in the Buddhist Tantra, but nevertheless representing a kind of consistent application of orthographic principles. And by the end of the first millennium, in the Common Era, Om is showing up in more and more inscriptions. So in this 12th century inscription from Bihar, we have a similar O shape, but with the moon and dot on top, the Chandrabindu representing the nasal. And if you're interested in seeing these in context on the slides, you can always look at the beginning of the inscription, which is where these Oms are positioned, right? Although I've blown them up for convenience on the side. And so here, as in many of the examples we're going to look at, Om introduced as a mantra, which Banerjee has transcribed as Om, Om, Namo, Narayanaya. Om, Om, homage to Narayana. Now, this repetition of Oms that Banerjee reads here, I'm going to return to that issue later, right? So we'll bracket that. As a South Indian parallel, consider this somewhat earlier 9th century inscription from Tamil Nadu in the Grantha script. So this rubbing is a bit hard to make out, but again, you can see in the upper left at the beginning of the inscription, this Om sign. And Hulch transcribed this as a mantra in praise of Shiva, Om Namas Shivaya. And although the shape is markedly different from the North Indian examples we looked at, right? The idea is still the same. An initial O character here in Tamil Grantha script that's combined with a special sound denoting the ma sound. And here, you can really see the close relation of this form of Grantha to Brahmi, right? Because it looks a lot like the Brahmi ma we were looking at before. So these examples show that the oldest written Oms introduce mantras in manuscripts and inscriptions, as we would expect, and that the various shapes of Om depend on regional orthographic conventions. To put it more simply, scribes in this period wrote the earliest Oms no differently from how they wrote other words. So keep that in mind as we proceed through some more examples. But, and there's always a kind of but in scholarship, right? There's some disagreement about how to read these inscriptions. So from the Gupta period forward, it's customary to begin inscriptions, and I'm going back to my sharing here, with a curved symbol of some kind. So this 5th century, quite early, this Buddhist inscription in Sanskrit prose offers an example. And I've blown it up here. You would almost miss it if you were just looking at the rubbing itself. It's just this teeny little curve at the very beginning of the inscription, which has a little Y at the top. Reading this curved stroke as Om, J.F. Fleet maintained in 1888 that the syllable is, quote, represented by a symbol, not by letters. That is, Fleet suggests that Unlike other words, which are written with script and using fixed conventions, Om is a visual symbol unto itself. And he read this Om Namo Buddhana Bhagavato. So Om introducing a mantra in praise of the Buddha. We can find lots of variants of a curved symbol like this, including spirals opening to various sides, or squiggles, or lines with the hook on top. Here are a few collected by Bowles in a 1947 article. And many other European Orientalists followed Fleet, who was quite influential, in transcribing all of these spirals as Om. Now, I want to be clear, I disagree with this reading. I don't think that the spirals and curls, no matter what their shape, represent Om at all. But let's take a closer look. It turns out that the Orientalists, starting with Fleet, had based their interpretations on an earlier authority, al-Biruni, who's a Muslim scholar from Central Asia who wrote about India and science and culture and religion in his travelogues from the 10th century. And he had this to say about Om. Let me quote. Al-Biruni writes, "The Hindus begin their books with Om, the word of creation, as we Muslims begin them with, in the name of God. The figure of the word Om is like this, and in the Al-Biruni manuscripts, there's a drawing of some kind of spiral, such as are represented here. This figure does not consist of letters. It is simply an image invented to represent this word, which people use, believing that it will bring them a blessing and meaning thereby a confession of the unity of God." So this writing very clearly shows that Al-Biruni too thought that Om had its own special symbol, its own special sign, and that this sign or symbol was a spiral. So to test this, let's examine some of the inscriptions that were known in Al-Biruni's time and in the centuries that follow. Beginning an inscription with a spiral or curl or hook of some kind was a widespread convention in North Indian inscriptions of the early medieval period. So in this 9th century CE Sanskrit inscription from Maharashtra, a spiral begins the first line. And Hulch transcribes that spiral as Om, and with good reason, right? The symbol precedes a mantra, Nama Vishnave, homage to Vishnu. And so given what we know about mantras and Om, it would appear to make a lot of sense to start an inscription with a formula just like that, Om Nama Vishnave. Or take the 7th century stone inscription from Uttar Pradesh, which starts with a curl, slightly different shape, but also in this case followed by Namaha, the word for homage, right? And Buehler surmises, because it appears as the first term, this spiral before Namaha, that this curlicue must represent Om. And examples like this can be multiplied many hundreds of times over. And it leads to the readings that I shared earlier with you in those earlier slides where people read 2 Oms in a row, right? And I'll show you some more examples like that. So following the Orientalist consensus, many Indologists today endorse this spiral as Om interpretation. But I have my doubts. And that's because as I flip through plates and inscriptions and look at them carefully, I keep finding spirals, curls, and crooks juxtaposed with actual legible Oms in early Nagari script, as in this example, right? So consider this 10th century inscription, also from Uttar Pradesh, which opens with a spiral. You see it here, right, at the beautifully reproduced here. But then is followed by a legible Om, right, written as we would expect in this script. And Keelhorn transcribes this, influenced by the kind of Orientalist consensus of the time, as Om, spiral, Om, script, Namah Shivaya. So this double repetition of Om before this mantra. But let's pause to think about that. That reading assumes that Om is repeated twice in the same inscription, in the hand of the same scribe, as far as we know, first with the spiral and then with script. To me, it just doesn't seem likely that two different signs right next to each other would both signify Om. Nor is there much precedent in mantra culture to have a formula that begins with two Oms in a row, right? Om, Om. Usually the mantra only has one Om, Om Namah Shivaya. And we can, adding to our skepticism, we'd note that markedly different curly shapes have been read as Om. So this 11th century inscription on stone, once again from Uttar Pradesh, features a right turning crook right before the opening of the mantra. So a very different shape. And yet Keelhorn reads this one the same way. Om, Om, Namah Shivaya, right? And then this 11th century Benares copper plate, same thing. It opens with a different shape, an S shape in this instance, but it prompts a similar reading of Om Om. And so Buehler reads this, Om Om Namah Shivaya. And finally, although it's a bit damaged, you can still make out in the upper left here this elaborate design consisting of curls and a circle, followed by a legible Om. Right here at the start of this 12th century stone inscription from Mathura. And so Buehler transcribes this as a formula venerating Ganapati. So he transcribes it as Om Om Ganapataye Namaha, right? And I've tried to reproduce this as best I could. It's just kind of hodgepodge of curls and dots on the side, followed by a legible Om, right? This kind of three shape with a dot on it. And I could give you dozens more examples like these. Almost every inscription I've found that opens with Om plus a mantra has some curly shape at the beginning. But sometimes the curls and spirals also open inscriptions without Om and without Hindu mantras. And this detail is significant because it shows that curls and spirals are not necessarily part of mantra culture as Om most demonstrably is. And we also find curly shapes opening Buddhist and Jain inscriptions, sometimes with mantras in Prakrit and sometimes without. But the fact remains that since al-Biruni's time, many scholars have continued to interpret all of these signs alike as Om, notwithstanding the diversity of shapes and contexts. But already in 1924, a Bengali scholar named Nandikanta Bhattacharya had contested this prevailing view. Starting in the first centuries of the Common Era, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain inscriptions alike often use another word, the word Siddham, meaning success in Sanskrit and Prakrit, as an opening benediction for manuscripts and inscriptions. And Bhattacharya argued that the spiraloid symbol that we're seeing everywhere stands not for Om, but for this word, Siddham. So let me show you some examples of Siddham and the argument he was making. In this slide, we have a very early 2nd century inscription from Mathura, which has an instance of Siddham inscribed, in this case using characters, right? And it's this Jain inscription. So this is the word Siddham as it's written in this Jain inscription in the 2nd century Common Era. And the basic idea, which has been fleshed out by paleographers since Bhattacharya, is predicated on the fact that scribes often used mangala symbols, right? Abstract signs to convey auspiciousness at the beginning of their work. And what scholars have hypothesized is that over time, the script used to represent Siddham morphed into an actual symbol that was conventionally used by scribes and took the shapes of various curls and stylized spirals, such as the ones collected here by Bhattacharya in a 2000 article. So how did this happen, right? If this is true, how do we go from a word that's written or inscribed, Siddham, right, with letters and characters, to a scribal symbol that's used widely? the answer may lie in manuscript culture and in this scribal custom of beginning writings with inscribed prayers for success. To mark these auspicious beginnings, scribes ornamented and stylized their work. According to two epigraphists, Roth and Sander, scribes across South Asia embellished the end of the word siddham until over time it had gradually morphed into such a Mangala symbol. And as an example of this, let's look at a Buddhist Sanskrit fragment from the Tarim Basin in the 6th century, reproduced by Roth. And this shows a rendering of the word siddham. See that, to begin the text. And here you have a Roman transcription. And I've also blown it up here at the bottom. But the reason this particular specimen is so intriguing is because according to Roth, and I find this quite convincing, it has, even though it's the word siddham using script, it has signs of scribal stylization that point to its eventual development into a spiral-like symbol. And this takes place around the dot representing a short ma, the dot and the line. And you can see here that that line has been curved around the dot. So it says siddham, right? That last sound, the line, which to communicate that sound, you'd only need a brief line under the dot, or even just the dot itself. But nevertheless, the scribe kind of extends the line and hooks it around the dot. So according to Roth and Sander, the final result of this scribal development would have been a completely stylized curl or spiral representing the word siddham, with the word itself fading from use. And Bhattacharya in his work showed that the spiral symbol only appears in texts where the word siddham has been omitted, right? They never appear together in the same text. That is, he argued that the symbol clearly substitutes for the verbal formula. And he also pointed out, as we've already seen, that in later inscriptions, the spiral symbol typically precedes a legible Om, thus suggesting that the symbol and Om could not be one and the same. And this slide shows a siddham next to a legible Om. And you can notice that the Om is also somewhat stylized and closely resembles the curly shape of the siddham. So you can see here in the upper left, this example of the siddham followed by an Om, which has a particularly long tail. And then I want to just kind of conclude this little excursus into siddham by talking about a fascinating side note. Bhattacharya, being from Bengal, gives ethnographic evidence from scribal culture in his time in modern Bengal. And he reports that Bengali scribes use this symbol, this curl, and they call it the Anji symbol. And they use it as a way to represent and then invoke a blessing as they begin to write. So in this slide here, which is a Unicode representation of the Anji, give us an idea of what he's referring to. And this is a stroke that is made, a little curl or spiral that's made by the scribe as they begin to write, right? Whatever text, and they call it the Anji, but it's pronounced out loud as they're writing. It's almost kind of a ritualized beginning to writing. It's pronounced out loud, siddham, or a close synonym, siddhir astu, let there be success. Let this undertaking have success. And I should also say that I was not able to locate any Bengali manuscripts that have instances of this to kind of confirm what Bhattacharya is talking about, but I've seen it discussed online in various kind of typeface and font forums, and so that's where I got this. But if anyone listening has an example of a Bengali manuscript with the Anji, I would be really happy to see that. So, since Bhattacharya's time, some of the most eminent epigraphists of the 20th century have accepted this argument. That includes D.C. Sircar and Richard Solomon, both of whom have affirmed that the spiraloid symbol represents siddham, not Om. And yet, and this is the reason why I'm kind of really driving this point home, very few scholars working in Indology or yoga studies or Sanskrit studies have paid much attention to this little corner of scholarship. And I continue to get into debates with colleagues and Indologists who want to read the spiral as Om, right, in spite of this impressive work showing another alternative interpretation. So let me just say this very plainly, right, for the record. I really think that we should abandon the outmoded interpretation of spirals and curls as Om. There's very little evidence to sustain such an interpretation, and as you've just seen, I think there's a mountain of evidence against it. All right, so in the time I have left, I'm about 2/3 through my remarks here. Let me just kind of try to orient us more broadly in Om's visual history. How do these arcane materials and debates really relate to Om's visual history as a written sign and icon? I promise they do, and let me explain why. First, they underline the importance of orthography, right? The conventions for using script to encode words in the earliest phases of the syllable's visual history. Next, the evidence shows that Om's glyph only appears within written text to introduce mantras. And yet these mantras are rarely embedded in a clear ritual context. They're just kind of written as to begin the undertaking, and then that's it, it's political discourse. So even though we know from other texts that the sacred syllable was widely chanted, contemplated, and worshipped in Vedic, yogic, and tantric traditions all through this time, up through the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, nevertheless, no material evidence that I've seen survives to show how Indian religious practitioners in that time period employed visual media with Om as the central symbol, right? So what I'm saying is that in the material culture of religious life during this first millennium of the Common Era, when Tantra and early yoga get going, we just don't have any freestanding iconic Oms that I've seen, right? And so I want to underline this point, because nowadays we're accustomed to seeing Om in mandalas, in altars, in temples, in paintings, posters, tattoos, t-shirts, and that may lead us to assume that the sacred syllable on its own, right, not just as a part of a mantra, part of inscription, but on its own has always been the focus of visual representation. In other words, that it's always been an icon throughout Indian religious history. But so far, I've just found very little evidence to support this for this early pivotal millennium of, that I'm talking about. And so iconographic uses of the sacred syllable, as in this temple implement in a South Indian temple to Murugan, are much more recent than we might expect. And a shout out to Borayin Larios for this beautiful image. So to me, this framing prompts a key question. When and in what circumstances does the Om glyph become a visual symbol on its own terms, an icon? Not just part of a mantra or a little part of an inscription, but the main event, right? From what I can tell of the art historical record, it seems that, number one, this transition happened several centuries after the syllable's appearance in manuscripts and inscriptions, and two, that it took place in the context of tantric ritual culture. So I would argue that the written sign for Om that we've seen in so many inscriptions and manuscripts becomes an icon through rituals, especially in rituals that use script. A broad movement of tantricization influences Indian ritual and religion starting in the early medieval period. And this trend transcends religious boundaries, encompassing Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions alike. Tantra emphasizes ritual, mantra, visualization, embodiment, and the use of script in new ways. And a central aim of tantric traditions is for the practitioner to chant and then internalize mantras, which are conceived as deities in sonic form. The most powerful tantric mantras are monosyllables called seed syllables or bijaksharas. And tantric practitioners throughout medieval Asia embraced Om as a tantric bija. You might consider this example in Tibetan Lansa script from a cave mural. And I want to just thank Rob Linroth for making his collection available via ArtStore. It's a great database for images. And this is just a beautiful seed syllable representation of Om, one of the oldest that I've seen. And it has a kind of flaming Chandrabindu on top. or we could compare a somewhat later Om seed syllable from 17th century Japan in Siddham calligraphy. And this is from Von Gulick's book on the Siddham script. So tantric traditions adopted new media and ritual techniques, right? And script is one of these new media. The use of script to write and visually represent mantras and to use them in ritual was a crucial innovation. And I'm not speaking here, again, of simply writing mantras down in manuscripts, like you just say the mantra, write it down to record it. No, I mean the use of script as a central feature of ritual practice. And in some cases, as many of you must be aware, this involves eventually making material objects and diagrams with script forms of Om, right? Amulets, mandalas, yantras like this one, and so forth. And then it also involves the kind of virtual and imaginative use of script. To internalize a deity's power, the practitioner has to visualize mantras in graphic form and install them on the subtle energy centers of the yogic body. In other words, the practitioner uses the script forms of mantras not only by physically writing and drawing them, but by meditating on them. So in the time we have left, let's look at a few examples to see how all of this could have emerged to the emergence of Om iconography. And I'll focus on 3 brief case studies from Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain Tantra. In Hindu Tantra, Kashmiri Shaiva speculations about Om emphasize the drop or point, bindu. That's the subtle sound of the nasalized at the end of Om's utterance. And the bindu is regarded as the syllable's potent sonic essence. And yet, the importance of bindu is based not only on the syllable's sound, right, but on its written form. The bindu takes its name from the diacritic point that we've been focusing on, that graphically represents this nasalized Om in manuscripts and inscriptions. And according to André Poudu, the visual representation of this sound as a point, bindu, ensured that it became the pointed focus, if you will, of speculation. In other words, the dot itself attracts the eye and makes it useful for meditation and visualization. So let me give an example of this from a Shaiva text. The Swachanda Tantra codifies a contemplative practice with Om that involves sound, script, and the subtle energies of the yogic body. This is the sonic ascent or uchara of Om from the base of the spine to the crown of the head. The aim is to harness Om's power by chanting it, picturing it, and then embodying it completely. Chanting Om in a quiet voice, the practitioner visualizes the graphic form of the syllable. And the text presents this as the metaphysical inscription of the mantra on the subtle body. In other words, it's not writing using a stylus, right? Or writing using a paintbrush. It's writing using the mind, right? Using script to kind of metaphysically imagine and inscribe this mantra on the subtle body. In addition to the audible sound, as he chants it, the practitioner tunes in to the inaudible, subtle sound levels of Om. This begins with the nasal resonance of bindu, right, as the sound finishes, followed by 8 progressively more subtle levels of vibration that end in silence. And so, reading an account of this based on Poudu's work, it occurs to me that this intricate technique shows how the ritualized integration of sound, script, and meditation might have shaped Om's visual history. Here, we don't have actual objects and material culture to attest Om's ritual use as an icon. But we have texts like the Swachanda that codify techniques involving script and the imagination. And so as we grapple with Om's visual history, I would suggest that we include examples of visualization like this one. Ritual informs iconography. If we shift gears and turn to Central Asian Buddhist Tantra, we find actual material specimens of this phenomenon of Om's ritual iconography. Gergely Hidas reproduces a 10th century Dharani print from Dangwang, and this is a woodblock that depicts Avalokiteshvara within a circle of Sanskrit text in the Siddham script, right? So you can see the Bodhisattva depicted here, and then this circle of text. Now, a dharani is a type of Vajrayana Buddhist formula. These are mantras that can be recited out loud, but also inscribed and worn as amulets. And in this specimen, 4 different seed syllables are depicted at the 4 corners of the central design, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you see one of them you may be able to make out is an Om. And in the upper left. And Hidas reads the curl that begins the text. Look at this spiral, that should look familiar, because I've been ranting about spirals for the last half an hour. Hidas reads that curl as Siddham, right? Correctly in my view, and distinguishing it from the obviously legible Ohms that are repeated throughout. So here's another Ohm that's inserted in the text of itself. Then on the left side, we have Chinese text that explains the effects of wearing this particular formula as an amulet. And it reads, "Those who wear and keep it will have their sins destroyed. Good fortune will arise for them, and they are to become a Buddha." In this way, the inscription of Om contributes to a material, wearable instrument of tantric practice. And as my final example, Ellen Goff's research on Jain Tantra provides another perspective on the interplay of ritual and iconography. The distinctive shape of the Jain Om comes from the combination of an O sound plus a nasalized Ma in the Jaina Nagari script, right? This kind of Chandrabindu type shape. The basic form is not that far off from the numeral 3 shape that we've seen in so many other examples. According to Goff, a 12th century Jain text tells how to construct a ritual diagram with Om that's called the Siddha Chakra, the wheel of the liberated soul. And a much later manuscript contains an actual image of the Siddha Chakra as codified by that earlier text. So an actual image of the wheel. And we basically have a ring of Jain Ohms, you can see them here in the center, surrounding the Prakrit mantra for the liberated soul, Arham. And then in this rather abstract design of a lotus, each of the petals, there are 8 of them, surrounding contains a written Om, the base of which is extended as a spiral 3 times around the central glyph, right? So we see spirals again following us as we go through this visual history. And according to this Jain text, meditation on the Siddha Chakra eradicates karma and leads to liberation. Goff also writes about how other Jain materials refer to a multicolored icon of Jain Om, with each of the 5 supreme lords placed on 5 different colors of the Om icon, white, yellow, red, blue, and black. And here is an early modern image, which Karina Vessels-Mavison shared with me, of a similar Om, although green seems to be substituted for white. And by the 12th century, you can look at Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra, which codifies meditation on the Supreme Lords and describes using a multicolored Om just like this one. And the aim of this practice, according to that Yoga Shastra, is to destroy karma and achieve liberation. So summing up, Goff says that among Jains at least, quote, "the sounding of Om is far less important than focusing one's mind on a physical representation of it." Now, by the early modern period, other traditions also developed their own distinctive iconographies. A noteworthy trend is painting of Hindu gods in Om, right? We saw some posters of that from the 20th century when I began, but let's look at a few earlier examples. Here's a Hindu Om from Jammu, 18th century, from the Berkeley Art Museum, and Bob Del Bonta pointed this out to me. And this has various deities arrayed in different positions throughout the icon. Here's a Pahari version of a similar thing with different kind of divine tableaus inserted into this Hindu Om icon. Or consider this gorgeous gilt Ohm from the Yale University Art Gallery, which is just a beautiful specimen, like full of a lot of amazing designs, and even kind of set, interestingly, in an Islamicate arch, right? So it has this kind of architectural feature that might lead us to associate it with Mughal painting. This happens to resemble specimens from illuminated manuscripts of the Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, like this one from the University of Edinburgh. Or this one which Hamsa Stanton shared with me, which is an Om with gods embedded in Sharada script on a long manuscript of stotras and epic from the collection of McGill University. Okay. So let me wrap this up now by jumping back to the present day and to this question that I began with. The most iconic representation of Om, the one we're all probably most familiar with, the one we see across India and all over the world, is this symbol in modern Devanagari. And I began my talk today by suggesting that this glyph deviates a bit from how we would expect Om to be written in modern Devanagari. Specifically, it has this stubborn little tail or hook or spiral or loop on its right side. As I mentioned, the rules for modern Nagari orthography represent O and a nasal differently. And indeed, you can see in 19th century print culture that this isn't just a kind of abstract idea, it's a way that Om was represented in some publications of the time. This one by an Orientalist author. This is the frontispiece from Moore's Hindu Pantheon, which depicts a Ganesha Murti with an Om in this kind of standard orthographic representation with an O sound and then the Anusvara dot. And I'd like to thank Holly Schaefer for sharing this with me. Or this came from a SOAS affiliate, Daniel Simpson. This cover of an edition of Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, which similarly has an iconic Om represented in this kind of standard orthographic way in the 1920s. So again, in face of these kind of examples and everything I've explained, where does this kind of familiar Om symbol come from, the one with the distinctive hook or tail on the right? One scholar, Gadre, has tried to explain this shape, right, that we know so well, as a graphic transformation of Upanishadic speculations on Om, such as the famous bow and arrow simile from the Mundaka Upanishad. And so Gadre argues that with passages like that in mind, scribes or artists along the way transformed this kind of bow and arrow shape into the Om glyph that we see all around us. Or in the case of this one from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, there's a simile about a fire drill. So, a stick and a block of wood that are used to kindle fire in Vedic sacrifice, and Om is related to that simile. And so Gadre kind of ingeniously imagines this graphic development from an actual fire drill to a more kind of abstract fire drill that's eventually turned on its side and comes to look like Om here, right? Alongside these kind of explanations, we can include the so-called phonographic explanation that I mentioned earlier. And according to Aseparampil, who writes about this, you would derive this Devanagari glyph from these constituent phonemes that are the subject of all kind of speculation in the Upanishads and other texts. A plus U plus Ma transformed to Chandrabindu gives you this composite Om, right? And so I love to think with these ideas. I love these ideas. They're great food for thought, but I really don't buy them, right? Because creative explanations like this violate the pattern that we've kind of, painstakingly established in going through these inscriptions, where a written or inscribed Om is formed according to basic orthographic principles, not according to the fancies or hermeneutic speculations of an artist or ritualist necessarily, but according to kind of the normal paleographic development of script. And so I sincerely doubt that the Devanagari Om symbol was based on Upanishadic speculations or the artificial combination of other characters. Instead, I'm looking for an explanation that's based on paleography. And so let me offer my best guess of what that might be. In medieval Nagari scripts, a 3 shape, such as we've seen, with a tail or a hook, as in this example on the left, represents the diphthong ow in Sanskrit. But as Pandit Ojha explained way back in 1918, there is evidence that in some forms of regional Nagari, this sign, right, the 3 with the hook on it, represented an O instead. And so Ojha conjectures that at the end of the 11th century AD in Nagari writings, for O, the old form of ow was used, right? So ow goes to O, and a new character was developed in its stead for ow, this one on the right, okay? So this is a very kind of arcane detail of paleography and epigraphy that this pundit points out. And another scholar named Kapadia observes that this phenomenon might explain where this kind of distinctive glyph for Om comes from. And I want to, again, acknowledge Ellen Goff, who brought these writings and scholarship to my attention. So in a nutshell, something changed in scribal culture so that in certain forms of Nagari, an O was represented in this way, right? And more research needs to be done in order to confirm this. But if the transposition of the old Nagari ow for O was a broader trend across medieval India, then we could surmise that inscribed ohms with this distinctive shape led to the eventual emergence of iconic ohms with such a form, as in this beautiful poster by Ravi Varma of a young Krishna. And so if we can find more examples in the historical record, then we'll be a lot closer to explaining the peculiarities of the modern Devanagari Om symbol that is so widespread in yoga culture today. So thanks so much for your attention. That was a long argument, dense, packed with information. I hope you have some time to stick around for discussion. I'm happy to take as many questions as you have.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And we do have some questions. We've got a few there, and feel free to add more if anyone wants to go to the Slido. The first one is from Nicholas. There's a Nicholas on our participant list, so Ruth, who's assisting, is going to unmute you if you want to ask your question directly. I'd ask everyone to keep the questions brief. We've only got about 5 minutes or so, but we could possibly stick around a little bit more. So Ruth, if you could unmute Nicholas.
Hello.
Hi.
Dr. Gerety, that was a very interesting talk, and I would like to ask you if you have any, if you have knowledge of some early instances of the usage of the visual symbol as a reference to subtle sounds in meditation. To subtle sound and meditation?
Yeah, is that correct?
Yeah. Meditation.
Yeah, so the earliest examples that I know about come in various tantric texts, right? And I've enumerated just a few examples of that in my case studies. But they're, my sense is that they're fairly widespread. The Swachanda Tantra is a great example of an earlier one. But I think especially in the scholarship of Andre Padu, you can find examples of this, because in his article, The Oral and the Written, he really aggressively pursues this idea that the use of script as a new medium in Tantra was kind of incorporated into ritual. So I won't offer any specific citations other than the ones that I gave in my talk, but I would point you to the vast corpus of medieval Tantra and encourage you to do some digging. I'm sure you'll find a lot more examples like this.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Gulnihal.
Yes, hello. Thank you,
Hey there.
Martha, for turning on my microphone. Thank you.
Oh, we've lost you, I think.
You want to try again? I heard you for a second.
I do have it here written, but let's...
Yeah, Martha, maybe you can read.
I'll have to read that one out.
Question.
Sorry about that. So she's asking, are there any written accounts of Om in Persian and Arabic texts other than Al-Biruni's?
Yeah, that's an aspect of this that I wasn't able to include in this lecture, just for I've already taken up too much of your time, but it's a really important question. Supriya Gandhi at Yale University has done a lot of work on Darshako, right? The kind of Mughal prince who had esoteric interests in Sufism, Hinduism, and mantra culture and meditation, and has given at least one talk on the importance of Om in Darshako's writing and milieu, right? So I can refer you to that talk and Supriya's work, and also just signal that this is something that I plan to come back to in the book, so there will be references to that forthcoming. But the short answer is it was disseminated widely across the kind of pre-modern South Asian world, and that includes in Islamic and Sufi contexts. Thanks for that question. Okay. And I should add to that, one of Supriya's great examples of this is that Om written like with a 3 with some diacritic dots on it in one modern printing of Darshako's work is turned on its side, and the editor notes that it represents the sign for Allah. So I'm not an expert in Arabic or Persian, but there's definitely some record of kind of esoteric visual transference between Om and Islamic culture.
Thank you. And Ruth Westerby, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Martha, and thanks, Finn. That was a really fascinating talk. I wondered if there was any evidence from the grammarians, from the Vyakarana tradition, of orthographic accounts of Om, or did they just speak about the more philosophic aspects?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. That's a really great question, because I mean, as you know, the grammarians, you know, most famously in the writings of Bhartrhari, are interested in the transcendence of shabda, of sound, right? And Om is sometimes invoked in formulating this doctrine. I don't know, I haven't delved deeply into the grammarians' works to see if there's some confirmation in the text of the orthography. I'm pretty sure that there are, in various commentaries on the Mandukya Upanishad, so not quite the world of the Sanskrit grammarians, but something at least related, some accounts of explaining Om's constituent phonemes and sound in relation to the way that it's written, right? But those are details that I'm putting down and I can't give you a specific information on. But I share your interest in this because I think in some ways, in the absence of really early examples of material culture, like actual inscriptions or paintings or frescoes that have survived, or manuscripts, what our best sources are going to be texts that describe the writing of Om, right? And I'm still, combing through this vast corpus of Sanskrit texts to find more of those.
Great. So we have a few other questions, anonymous though, so I'm not sure who they are. So someone's asking, is this broadly to say, I think as in is your thesis, that evidence for the origins of Iconography written Om are likely to be found in tantric scribal culture?
Yes, well put. I wish I had put it so pithily. we could have saved a half an hour of my lecture. Yeah, I would, yes. So I think that tantric scribal culture is a place that we should really search in greater detail, right? But I want to be clear that although scribes were obviously involved in this kind of transmission and creation, I see ritual as the primary venue for where Om emerges as an icon, right? So a scribe has this kind of artisanal or mechanical function of recording sounds and mantras and transferring them into the medium of writing, right? Whatever, paper, bark, whatever it may be. But it's in ritual where you elevate a certain sound alone, take it out of a mantra, like Om, or like the other bijas that are associated with the chakras and various systems of the subtle body. So it's actually in tantric ritual speculation, influenced by scribal culture, I think, that you get this kind of development of this idea of transcendent Om that can be represented in script. And, you know, in some of the examples that Padu gives, it's script that's kind of flaming or illuminated, right? And actually, in a fascinating way, that example from that Tibetan cave mural gives some corroboration of that.
Great. So I think we'll have one final question here,
Okay.
which may or may not be something you know about, is what is the earliest representation of Om in Chinese character form?
This is a great question too. So I don't know anything about Chinese literary culture or writing culture. So I will have to kind of defer that to experts and colleagues who know better. But an interesting detail of this is that in tracking down the kind of earliest Buddhist texts to talk about Om, I had a conversation with Ron Davidson, who's in his work suggested he's found Om in Dharani form in texts that are in Chinese, right? So that would suggest a kind of pre-tantric or kind of earlier than the Indian tantric evidence. We have Chinese manuscripts that are codifying Dharanis that include Om in Chinese characters. So if Ron's hunch is correct, then you would probably find that somewhat ironically, that the earliest written representations of Om are not in an Indic script at all, but in Chinese characters. So it kind of would end up being kind of a fascinating curiosity of this cultural history.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. We'll leave it there, but I'm just about to allow people to unmute yourselves. So if you want to unmute and show your appreciation, round of applause or thank yous for Finn.
Thank you all so much. It was a real pleasure. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Finn.
That was great.
Thank you.
Hey, Finn.
You again.
Hey, Finn. Hey, bro. Hey, Finn.
Lots of appreciation from my family there. Thank you, guys.
Yes, and thank you very much, and thank you also to Ruth, who's been assisting tonight. Please look out again for this on our YouTube channel, which should be appearing in a few days, as will all of our talks. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you to SOAS. And I just want to commend everyone who stuck with me through that hour-long argument. I hope you took some nuggets from that will be useful to you.
Definitely. Great.
Okay.
Well, I will end the meeting now, but thank you all for coming. Bye.